Welcome back to Plainside Docks. Tonight, we continue our journey into America's dark territories, where the illusion of safety shatters and a relentless predator hides in the shadows. We're heading to Virginia's Colonial Parkway, a scenic 23-mile stretch connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. But its peaceful, isolated beauty became the perfect hunting ground for a killer. The parkway, dark and secluded at night, was a popular spot for couples seeking privacy. But this very isolation made it a dangerous place. From 1986 to 1989, a series of double murders and disappearances unfolded, sending shockwaves through Virginia. It all started on October 12, 1986, when Cathy Thomas, a 27-year-old Navy ensign, and her 21-year-old partner, Rebecca Dowski, disappeared from a scenic overlook. The car was found locked and undisturbed, but the women were gone. Days later, their bodies were found, strangled and bizarrely staged inside the car. The crime scene was chaotic, and jurisdictional confusion led to a missed opportunity to catch the killer early. The killer paused for nearly a year, then struck again in 1987, abducting David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14. Their bodies were found shot and dumped in a remote area, confirming the killer's growing reach. But police failed to connect the dots, thinking the cases were isolated. The terror spread across Virginia, with the killer operating across county lines. The parkway was his territory, and as the investigation faltered, he slipped further into the shadows, hunting without interruption. If you're as fascinated by chilling mysteries as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to click the bell so you never miss out. The Colonial Parkway was a masterpiece of mid-century landscape architecture, a quiet retreat where the only potential disturbance was the rustle of leaves or the ebb of the river tide. This quietude, which felt like a sacred promise to local residents, was violently shattered in the early hours of October 12, 1986. The crime itself had occurred days earlier, transforming a picturesque historic site into a hidden, brutal monument to terror. It began with the agonizing process of reporting two young women missing, Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Cathy, 27, was a highly disciplined and ambitious Navy ensign, a woman whose life was built on structure and adherence to schedule, carving out a career in a demanding field station nearby. Rebecca, 21, was a promising student at the College of William and Mary, focused on her studies. They had been seen leaving a campus computer lab late on the night of October 9, 1986. Then silence. A silence that was not instantaneous, but stretched across days, confusing authorities and costing critical time. The family's fear was palpable and immediate, fueled by the knowledge that these were not impulsive individuals. Cathy Thomas, with her Navy training, was not someone to deviate from a plan. Rebecca Dowski would not simply abandon her life. They did not simply disappear. The initial delay in classifying the case as a potential homicide, a delay rooted in the initial assumption of a runaway situation, tragically influenced by bias regarding the victim's lifestyle, was a catastrophic early failure. This delay allowed the crime scene to cool and potential tracking dogs to lose the scent in the damp, cool autumn air. The silence around their vanishing was a shield for the killer, reinforced by police bias and a shocking lack of initial urgency. The critical first 48 hours, the golden window of any homicide investigation, were utterly squandered by assumptions and bureaucratic inertia. 3 days later, the search focused on one of the isolated gravel turnoffs of the Colonial Parkway. It was there, pushed down a steep embankment near a dense thicket of trees, that a Park Service ranger discovered Cathy Thomas' white 1980 Honda Civic. The scene was deeply unsettling, not because of what was missing, but because of what was contained within the small space of that sedan. The car was locked. There was no sign of a forced entry, no shattered glass, no evidence of a dramatic struggle that would alarm others nearby. It was neat. Too neat. This clinical precision spoke of a killer who achieved absolute control instantly, without a need for chaos. He had subdued them quickly, likely using surprise or the immediate threat of a weapon the instant he encountered them in the car. The small interior, often seen as a place of refuge and intimacy, became a claustrophobic torture chamber. When the officers managed to access the vehicle, they found the two women dead positioned in a manner that defied the typical chaos of a crime scene. Their bodies showed evidence of extreme violence. They had been strangled and severely cut. The violence seemed personal, perhaps even ritualistic, but the setting was utterly impersonal. The killer had meticulously managed a terrifying act within the confines of a compact car in absolute darkness. The positions of the bodies suggested a deliberate staging, an intent to communicate a message of dominance and violation to the first person who would discover them. The killer spent time in the car basking in the aftermath, ensuring his signature was clear, demonstrating a level of detachment that chilled even hardened investigators. Crucially, key elements were present at the scene that should have immediately screamed serial predator. Both women had been bound with rope, and forensic examination found evidence of a specialized nautical knot used near the scene. This detail suggested the killer had a specific skill set, or perhaps even a trade connected to sailing, climbing, or the Navy, a detail hinting at a calculated methodology that police for days failed to exploit. The type of rope was also distinctive, often used for boats or heavy outdoor rigging, an item not found in a typical commuter's car. The investigation should have immediately focused on local marinas, military bases, or boating communities. Instead, these specific unique identifiers were simply catalogued and left to sit. The lack of priority given to this crucial signature evidence was a direct result of the fractured investigation, and the car had been deliberately driven to this final spot and pushed down the embankment, driven by the killer himself after the murders were complete. This was not a passive abandonment. It was an act of final, deliberate concealment, suggesting the killer had intimate knowledge of the immediate terrain, knowing exactly where to hide a car so it would not be spotted from the main road. This act, taking command of the victim's vehicle and staging the scene, demonstrated a level of terrifying confidence. It suggested the killer was not a passing opportunist, but someone who viewed the entire landscape as his personal theater. He was controlling the very parameters of the police investigation before it even began, choosing where they would look and what they would see. The fact that he was audacious enough to spend time arranging the bodies in the car after the murder, all on a federally protected roadway, speaks to an utter lack of fear of detection. The killer understood that the perceived isolation of the parkway was his greatest ally, providing both darkness and a buffer against professional police response. However, the initial investigation was fractured from the beginning, a fatal consequence of the multi-jurisdictional setting. The murder had taken place on federal land, making the National Park Service, NPS, the lead investigative agency, but they were woefully under-equipped for a complex homicide case. The FBI was slow to classify it as a serial crime. State and local police, who had the experience, were relegated to supporting roles, creating immediate bureaucratic friction. The Virginia State Police, VSP, and the FBI were often at loggerheads, arguing over jurisdiction, protocol, and investigative leads, all while the crime scene cooled. The investigation was not driven by urgency, but by institutional rivalry, a condition the killer likely understood and exploited. This turf war was perhaps the greatest single gift the killer received, ensuring no one agency was fully accountable for the forensic failures. This jurisdictional confusion had fatal consequences. The crime scene was immediately compromised. Federal Park Police, unfamiliar with complex homicide processing, allowed essential evidence, hair fibers, potential fingerprints, to be either mishandled or allowed to degrade in the damp, cool weather of the fall. The technology of the 1980s was already limited. The procedural errors compounded that weakness. Any viable DNA evidence that may have been left was likely wiped out by contamination or poor collection techniques. The physical evidence was lost to the initial chaos and the subsequent bureaucratic delay. The focus of the initial police interview, rather than targeting suspicious individuals in the area, centered tragically on the victim's relationship, a tragic distraction fueled by bias that cost precious hours and days. The killer, if he was watching the news, knew he had been handed a head start. The failure to secure and process the scene, according to strict protocol, essentially handed the killer a lifetime pass, as evidence chain of custody was hopelessly broken. The investigators found themselves in a forensic vacuum. They had no physical evidence that could point to an external actor save for the rope. The tragedy of the Thomas Dowski case became a template for how not to manage a complex murder scene, a failure that would haunt the region for decades. The FBI was eventually forced to take the lead, classifying the case not just as a double homicide, but as a potential serial pattern. This belated recognition came at immense cost. The investigation stalled. The initial terror subsided into a grim cold case. The Parkway's overlooks were closed at night, a hollow gesture that did little to soothe the pervasive anxiety clinging to the region. It felt like a warning had been issued, and the community was holding its breath, praying that the shadow had passed. But the shadow had simply retreated into the deep corners of the state. For almost a year, the Parkway was quiet. The killer was invisible. The police had failed to look outside the parameters of the initial crime scene, creating a linkage blindness that the killer would exploit again and again. They were looking for a killer who only struck naval officers or students on the Parkway. The killer was proving he owned the entire region and could adapt his methods at will. The failure to connect the crime to a broader roaming predatory nature was the core of the 1986 failure. The tension in the region was palpable, an invisible shroud of dread hanging over every car that parked after sunset. Locals knew something fundamental had broken. The murder of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski was a declaration their secluded sanctuary was now a dark territory. The unspoken question that hung in the humid air was, how did the killer gain access to a locked car containing two physically capable victims? Profilers hypothesized the initial interaction must have been nonviolent. Perhaps the killer posed as an authority figure like a park ranger or a plainclothes officer, using the darkness and isolation to his advantage. This theory explains the lack of external struggle. The victim's potential compliance in the seconds before the deadly assault began. Then, in September 1987, the shadow returned, proving the predator had not left, only widened his reach and altered his signature just enough to throw off the localized police forces. The second pair vanished. David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, disappeared in September 1987. David was home from college taking Robin, his girlfriend, out for a drive. David, a respected local, and Robin, a teenager, presented a completely different victim profile from the first pair, further confusing the authorities. They were last seen together, their vehicle found not on the Colonial Parkway, but at the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge boat ramp, a desolate, isolated expanse of tidal water and thick woods, connected by remote county roads to the Parkway's overall dark territory. On September 21st, David's black Ford Ranger truck was found abandoned at the boat ramp. The scene was different yet disturbingly familiar. The truck was unlocked, the doors open. Valuables, including David's wallet and Robin's purse, were left inside, immediately ruling out robbery as a primary motive. The keys were gone. It was another unsettling tableau of abandonment, meticulously curated to confuse police and imply the occupants had left willingly or been taken instantly. The killer's signature was the removal of the keys and the untouched valuables, signaling that the motive was purely power and control, not financial gain. This deliberate staging was the true link that police failed to recognize instantly. The removal of the keys effectively disabled the vehicle, ensuring the victims could not use it for escape, and making the scene appear abandoned. Local police initially refused to link the case to the Thomas Dowski murders. They cited the difference in the victims' backgrounds, the difference in the crime scene location, and the differing methods of attack. One case was strangulation, and cutting in a small sedan. This was a potential shooting in a truck near a boat ramp. The police insisted, despite the desperate pleas of the families, that this was an isolated kidnapping, or perhaps a separate local incident. They were wrong. They were allowing the linkage blindness to deepen, giving the killer exactly what he wanted: a segmented, compartmentalized investigation. The lack of a unified task force allowed the predator to continue moving across the map unchallenged. The agonizing search lasted 2 months. The woods and waterways surrounding the James River were scoured by volunteers and divers in a desperate, futile effort. The damp, clinging chill of late autumn settled over the search area, mirroring the cold certainty growing in the community. These children were not coming home. The killer knew the remote terrain would destroy evidence. Finally, in November 1987, a hunter stumbled across the bodies of David and Robin, dumped deep in the woods near the refuge. They had been shot. David was shot once, suggesting he may have been killed first or quickly subdued. Robin was shot multiple times, another display of personalized, focused violence against the female victim. The forensic evidence, though degraded by the passage of time and exposure, was clear. This was not a chaotic crime. The violence was brutal, but the concealment was tactical. The killer had driven his victims to a remote location, executed them, and then dumped them in the dense undergrowth far from where their vehicle was found. This deliberate separation of the victims from their car was a terrifying escalation. It proved the killer had the ability to move his victims and control the crime narrative across multiple jurisdictions, using the vast, unmonitored dark territories of the region as his shield. He was demonstrating mastery over the region's geography and the investigative system's weakness. The 2 cases were now undeniable. 2 couples murdered while seeking privacy in isolated locations. 2 crime scenes staged to sow confusion. This was not a random act of violence. This was the work of a serial predator operating with a chilling lack of detection and demonstrating a deep, almost intimate knowledge of the region's most secluded corners. The Colonial Parkway killer had been formally announced not by a police press conference, but by the cold, definitive violence of his second attack, and the realization sent a wave of paralyzing fear through the entire historic triangle. No one was safe in their car. No one was safe in the dark. And worst of all, the authorities tasked with protecting them were utterly lost. They were chasing a phantom across county lines, constantly one step behind a killer who had already mastered the game of jurisdictional evasion. The initial failure to pool resources had just cost David Knobling and Robin Edwards their lives, solidifying the idea that the system itself was the killer's greatest ally. The discovery of David Knobling and Robin Edwards in the remote woods of the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge confirmed the terrible truth that the Colonial Parkway was dealing with a serial predator. But the crime, now linked across jurisdictions, was still viewed as 2 isolated attacks separated by a year. The killer had successfully masked his identity and his rhythm by shifting his method from strangulation and staging in a car to shooting and dumping the bodies in the woods. This adaptability confused the nascent multi-agency task force that had finally reluctantly begun to form. The police were looking for commonalities. They had the abandoned vehicles, the removed keys, the untouched valuables, and the isolated locations. These were psychological signatures of control, but they were difficult to translate into physical evidence that could generate a suspect. Forensic science in 1987 was struggling to keep pace with the killer's methodical planning. Fingerprints were rare. DNA was a distant dream. Detectives were left with gut instinct and a chilling sense of dread. The local community was paralyzed. The initial assumption that the Colonial Parkway was a targeted safe space, a haven where crimes were limited to those who sought illicit activities, had been utterly destroyed. The second murder proved that the entire region, every isolated boat ramp, every shadowy creek bed, every secluded stretch of highway was fair game. Parents warned their children against parking anywhere remotely dark or private. The custom of seeking intimacy on the parkway vanished overnight, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling terror. The killer had successfully weaponized the region's geography, turning its very isolation into a source of public fear and psychological paralysis. For almost a year after the Knobling and Edwards murders, the Colonial Parkway was quiet. The closure of the scenic overlooks did perhaps deter casual parking, forcing the predator to either relocate or wait. Law enforcement believed that the intense media coverage and the presence of FBI profilers might have spooked the killer into dormancy. They were wrong. The killer was not dormant. He was calculating, waiting for the perfect victim, the perfect moment of darkness and isolation to reassert his total control over the region. He was patiently observing the police response, seeing which areas were patrolled, which leads were prioritized, and confirming that the jurisdictional friction remained his greatest asset. The predator returned in April 1988. The new targets were Cassandra Sandy Hailey, 26, a student at Christopher Newport College, and Keith Call, 20, her friend. Sandy was described as vibrant and kind. Keith, a respected member of the community. They had planned to spend an evening together at a party, but decided instead to spend some private time near the parkway. Like the previous victims, they were seeking quiet intimacy in a place they believed offered refuge from the outside world, fundamentally underestimating the danger of the location. Their car, a white 1982 Toyota Celica, was found on April 10, 1988, at the Colonial Parkway's York River overlook. This time, the killer had chosen the original hunting ground, returning to the very heart of the fear he had created. The staging was a terrifying callback to the first crime. The car was found abandoned at the overlook, positioned facing the river. Once again, the keys were missing. Valuables were still inside the vehicle, reinforcing that control, not robbery, was the primary motive. There were no signs of a struggle visible from outside the car. The windows were intact. It was the familiar, unsettling tableau of a couple that had simply vanished from the face of the earth. But this time, there was one difference that chilled investigators to the core. The car's rear door was ajar. The driver's side door was open, swinging slowly in the damp night wind. This seemingly minor detail suggested a new wrinkle in the killer's methodology, a new level of confidence, or perhaps an entirely different point of contact with the victims. Did the killer approach them while they were inside and force them to get out? Did he pose as a law enforcement officer, using the dark uniform and the authority of the badge to command compliance? The fact that the driver's door was open and undisturbed implied compliance, or a sudden and overwhelming threat that offered no opportunity for resistance. This MO of using perceived authority or a simple ruse to disarm two people in a locked car became central to the profile. It suggested someone who knew how to project authority quickly and effectively. The search that followed was immense, fueled by the tragic knowledge gained from the two previous attacks. Helicopters, divers, and hundreds of volunteers scoured the York River shoreline and the deep woods around the overlook. The families of Sandy and Keith were thrust into the agonizing limbo that the Thomas, Dowski, Knobling, and Edwards families had already endured. But unlike the previous victims, Sandy, Hailey, and Keith Call were never found. Their disappearance became the most enduring and haunting mystery of the Colonial Parkway. Their abandoned vehicle sitting at the edge of the dark woods was a silent, frustrating witness to a crime that had swallowed them whole. The killer had left no bodies, no physical evidence that could be immediately linked back to him. He had simply used the darkness and isolation of the parkway as an effective, terrifying means of permanent concealment. The FBI was now hunting 4 sets of victims, with 4 bodies found and 4 bodies missing, a terrifying demonstration of the killer's utter mastery of the region's vast, unforgiving, dark territory. The police were now facing a complete void. They had 8 victims in 4 separate attacks, committed over 18 months, spanning 3 different county jurisdictions. The task force was paralyzed, unable to define a clear, consistent MO, unable to find a viable physical clue, and constantly struggling against the territorial instincts of the state and federal agencies involved. The hidden killer was winning, using the bureaucratic chaos and the vast, unlit darkness of his territory as his primary weapon. The Hailey and Call case was a declaration of the killer's invincibility, a taunt left at the same location as his first crime. The sheer tragedy of the Hailey and Call disappearance was that it proved the Colonial Parkway killer was escalating his confidence and daring. He had left no bodies, rendering forensic investigation useless, and had simply allowed the Virginia wilderness to swallow his victims whole. The abandoned car at the York River overlook became a silent monument to the power the killer wielded over law enforcement, a power derived entirely from his mastery of the region's isolated geography. The FBI task force, now fully aware they were dealing with a mobile serial predator, was forced into a desperate adaptation of its profile and strategy. They realized the killer was not following a predictable pattern of location or method. He had moved from strangulation and cutting Thomas and Dowski to shooting Knobling and Edwards, and now to permanent disappearance, Hailey and Call. This versatility suggested a killer who was patient, intelligent, and highly adaptable, a predator who treated the investigation like a chess game, intentionally rotating his MO to exploit the investigator's need for a single consistent signature. The psychological profile became terrifyingly clear. The killer's motive was purely control, and violation divorced entirely from robbery. The consistent staging of the abandoned vehicle's keys, removed valuables left untouched, was a signature meant to confuse the motive and maximize the psychological terror for the families and the public. He was not interested in material possessions. He was interested in the power to erase people from the face of the earth and leave behind only an empty vehicle as a taunt. This staging also suggested a meticulous nature, a criminal who was organized and took care to manage the scene, demonstrating a deep sense of entitlement over the lives he destroyed. The pressure on the task force was immense. The media had seized on the story, dubbing the area the Death Strip. Tourism plummeted, and the locals lived in a state of sustained anxiety. The fear was no longer localized to the Parkway. It was a regional illness. The FBI, seeking any breakthrough, doubled down on its public appeals, circulating composite sketches based on vague witness accounts, a strategy often employed when physical evidence is lacking. These sketches, however, often proved useless, as the killer likely wore disguises, or simply relied on the public's inherent inability to register an unremarkable face in moments of crisis. The atmosphere in the field offices was one of frantic, frustrated desperation, a direct consequence of the bureaucratic failures that had plagued the first two cases. The investigation was now fully consumed by its own history. Every new lead was filtered through the lens of the botched initial crime scenes, further frustrating investigators who knew the answers were likely lost in the contaminated evidence of 1986. They chased every suspicious vehicle reported on the Parkway, every local with a history of minor offenses, yet the killer remained invisible. Then, 6 months after the Hailey and Call disappearance, the hidden killer struck for the fourth time. The victims were Anna Maria Phelps, 18, and Daniel Lauer, 21. It was September 1989, 2 years after the second set of murders. Anna Maria and Daniel were traveling to Virginia Beach when they got lost. They made a fatal error. They pulled over onto the shoulder of Interstate 64, a major artery connecting to the Colonial Parkway system, to check a map. This simple act of confusion and vulnerability placed them directly in the killer's path. The time frame, the location, and the circumstances suggested a return to the killer's favorite environment: isolated stretches of road accessible by car, offering easy escape. Their car, a gold 1978 Chevrolet Nova, was discovered abandoned near an Interstate 64 rest stop in New Kent County on September 5, 1989. The staging was once again inconsistent, yet possessed the killer's unmistakable signature of control. The car was unlocked, and Daniel's wallet was left inside, but this time Daniel's shirt was found neatly tied around the steering column. This bizarre detail suggested another moment of absolute control, or perhaps a strange new ritualistic action performed after the crime. It was a detail that added another layer of confusion to an already baffling psychological profile. Was the killer attempting to cover up fingerprints, or was it another calculated piece of performance art, a final bizarre signature intended to mock the authorities? Investigators theorized this detail may have been a message, a reference point for the killer to remember the scene by. The audacity of this act, performed near a public rest stop, demonstrated the killer's supreme confidence in his ability to operate undetected. The investigation was now deeply compromised by history. By 1989, police were acutely aware of the risk of linkage blindness and were desperate to connect this crime. However, the sheer distance between the previous crime scene at the York River overlook and the current one in New Kent County complicated the narrative. The victims were found near a major interstate, not the historic parkway. Local law enforcement in New Kent County was initially hesitant to believe they were facing the famed Colonial Parkway killer, further wasting critical hours. The police initially investigated the possibility of the couple running away, delaying a coordinated search. The renewed search lasted weeks, covering hundreds of miles of remote Virginia woods. The families were once again thrust into the terrible limbo of the unknown. Unlike Sandy, Hailey, and Keith Call, however, Anna Maria and Daniel's bodies were eventually found. In October 1989, a month after their disappearance, a group of hunters discovered the severely decomposed remains of Anna Maria and Daniel in a dense, swampy area known as the Croker section of the Queen Creek drainage system, miles from where their car was found. The manner of death was critical. They had been violently stabbed, a third MO change. This shift from strangulation and shooting to stabbing proved the killer was fluid and adaptable, intentionally obscuring any single physical signature. His constant rotation of methods demonstrated a sophisticated, arrogant confidence in his ability to evade the slow, territorial police structure. The discovery of the bodies was a chilling relief to the families, ending the uncertainty, but providing new, brutal questions about the killer's motives. Forensic investigators had to deal with the harsh reality that decomposition, accelerated by the swampy environment, had destroyed any chance of finding trace DNA, further cementing the killer's successful use of the environment as an accomplice. The Colonial Parkway murders had now expanded to 4 couples, 8 victims, over a 3-year span, linked only by the killer's consistent psychological signature. The meticulous staging, the remote locations, the violation of intimacy, and the exploitation of the vast, isolated territories of Virginia. The killer was now at the height of his power, having successfully hunted and killed for 3 years without leaving a prosecutable trace. The terrifying consistency lay not in the weapon, but in the control he asserted over the crime scene and the aftermath. The police were left struggling against a predator who had essentially declared war on their entire system of criminal profiling. The discovery of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer's bodies in the Queen Creek drainage system solidified the terror that had gripped Virginia for 3 years. The forensic reality was grim. Decomposition, accelerated by the damp, swampy environment, had destroyed any chance of finding usable DNA evidence. The killer had again demonstrated an intimate, almost tactical knowledge of the region's geography, using the deep woods not just for concealment, but as a biological shield against investigative technology. With 8 victims across 4 pairs, the FBI task force finally consolidated its intelligence into a chilling, comprehensive profile of the Colonial Parkway killer. The profile painted a picture of a sophisticated, highly intelligent predator, likely a white male in his 20s or 30s, possessing local knowledge and possibly a connection to military or maritime environments, given the nautical knot found in the first case. This profile was precise, yet frustratingly abstract. The core defining trait of the killer was his absolute command and adaptability. He did not stick to a single method. He utilized strangulation and cutting. He used a firearm. He used a knife. And most chillingly, he proved he could simply make victims disappear, never to be found, as he did with Sandy Hailey and Keith Call. The consistency was not in the weapon, but in the MO of control. He targeted couples in vehicles, seeking privacy in remote spots, and then used deception or surprise to gain access and assert immediate, overwhelming dominance. The meticulous staging of the abandoned cars, the missing keys, the untouched wallets, the open door, was a psychological declaration of power, a way to dictate the terms of the investigation from a distance. He was not just killing, he was curating a narrative of terror. The police were forced to acknowledge they were hunting a master manipulator, a person who understood the limitations of the law enforcement structure better than the structure understood itself. By 1990, the investigation had become an exhausting, frustrating battle against the limitations of 1980s forensic science and the chaos of interagency turf wars. There was no CODIS database. DNA technology was in its infancy, and any minute trace evidence left behind in the compromised crime scenes was essentially unusable. The case relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, of which there were tragically few credible ones, none of which ever yielded a solid lead. The profile was accurate, yet useless, because without physical evidence or a prosecutable link, the killer remained an invisible entity operating in the dark. The terror peaked in the early months of 1990. The FBI, the Virginia State Police, and local sheriff's departments were fully mobilized. Patrols were intensified along the Colonial Parkway and adjacent highways, turning the former Lover's Lane into a heavily monitored security corridor. The intense scrutiny, the constant media coverage, and the public fear that kept couples off the road finally created an environment hostile to the killer's unique method. Then, just as suddenly as he began, the Colonial Parkway killer vanished. After the September 1989 murders of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, the attack ceased entirely. The predator, who had successfully hunted 8 victims over 3 years, went silent. This sudden, abrupt cessation of a serial crime spree is often the most significant and most frustrating piece of evidence in an unresolved case. It implies an external factor forced the stop, but which one? FBI profilers immediately developed 3 primary theories to explain the silence. The first, and most hopeful, was incarceration. The killer had been arrested and imprisoned for an unrelated lesser crime. He could be sitting in a Virginia jail or even a prison in a neighboring state, serving time for theft or assault, unaware that the system had him, yet powerless to resume his spree. This possibility generated years of painstaking, quiet work by law enforcement, cross-referencing thousands of inmate files against the vague physical profile. The second theory was relocation. The killer had left the state, perhaps driven away by the heightened police presence, or having satisfied a deep-seated psychological need to move on to a new hunting ground entirely. If he had crossed state lines, the task force was back to square one, fighting a phantom across an infinitely expanding map, potentially starting a new series of murders in another unsuspecting dark territory. The third, and most terrifying, was death. The killer had died naturally, or by accident, perhaps in a car crash on one of the very roads he patrolled. This theory held a cruel finality. The killer escapes justice forever, and the families are robbed of any possibility of closure. This theory gained morbid traction as months turned into years with no new attacks. Regardless of the reason, the Colonial Parkway killer was gone. He left behind 4 empty cars, 4 found bodies, 4 missing bodies, and a trail of investigative failure that spanned 3 state jurisdictions. The entire episode exposed critical weaknesses in the American criminal justice system. The pitfalls of rivalry, the tragic human cost of social bias in initial victim profiling, and the devastating gap between the complexity of a serial predator and the limitations of 1980s forensic technology. The local community suffered a profound, lasting psychological scar. The sense of security in the historic triangle was irrevocably damaged. A place meant for relaxation and intimacy became associated with dread, forever changing the way locals viewed their own landscape. The dark, unlit roads were no longer romantic. They were hostile. For the families of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call, the uncertainty was endless. With no bodies to mourn, they were trapped in a unique hell, forced to live on hope while their grief matured into a cold, persistent despair. Their fate remains the ultimate trophy the Colonial Parkway killer claimed. The Colonial Parkway today remains beautiful, tranquil, and historic. But for the families of the 8 victims, and for the agents who worked the case, it remains a territory defined by a cold, unfinished horror. The terror was replaced by a grim, persistent uncertainty. The predator was never caught, and the dark territory he claimed in Virginia still holds the secret of his identity and the final resting place of Sandy Hailey and Keith Cole. The case, now decades old, serves as a painful reminder that sometimes the killer's greatest triumph is simply walking away. The Colonial Parkway killer was not a criminal mastermind who outsmarted the police. He was a predator who simply exploited the glaring vulnerabilities inherent in America's fragmented system of law enforcement. His crimes were a perfect illustration of what happens when bureaucratic boundaries become shields for murder. The very first crime, the discovery of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in the Honda Civic in 1986, immediately initiated the disastrous chain of jurisdictional error. The body of the crime took place on the Colonial Parkway, a National Park Service property. This meant the NPS Police, an agency primarily focused on park regulations and minor infractions, was the lead. They lacked the experience, the resources, and the forensic training required for a double homicide of this complexity. The immediate investigative team was composed of park rangers who were experts in natural sciences and wildlife, not serial crime analysis. The Virginia State Police, VSSP, who had the specialized train in homicide experience, were immediately relegated to a supporting role, creating intense professional tension. The FBI, which should have been called in immediately due to the heinous nature of the crime and the federal jurisdiction, was slow to arrive and even slower to assume primary control. This reluctance created a critical vacuum in the initial golden hours. While the 3 agencies argued over who was in charge of the physical evidence, the scene was compromised. Meticulous forensic collection, the search for trace fibers, minute hairs, or usable fingerprints, was either poorly executed by the inexperienced NPS or simply impossible due to the delays. In murder that occurred inside a small vehicle, the opportunity for contamination is absolute. And in this case, that opportunity was tragically fulfilled. Crucial evidence, perhaps a single hair or skin cell that could have been the DNA key decades later, was likely lost in the first rush of untrained personnel through the scene. The lack of standard protocols meant that vital items were placed in incorrect packaging, further degrading any organic material the killer may have left behind. The psychological consequence of this infighting was immense. The VSP and the FBI quickly developed resentment, hindering the vital free flow of information. Documents were slow to be shared. Key pieces of evidence were often logged under the wrong agency's protocol. The killer, if monitoring the news, knew the police were looking inward, not outward. He knew his territory was protected not by his own cunning, but by the ego and procedural rigidity of the police chiefs. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, working from Quantico, quickly developed a profile identifying the killer as highly organized, possessing local knowledge, and likely using deception, possibly posing as an authority figure, to gain entry to the cars. This profile was immediately met with skepticism from local agencies still clinging to outdated theories about drifters or targeted revenge. The crucial psychological analysis was effectively sidelined by jurisdictional mistrust. The linkage blindness that resulted was profound. When the second set of victims, David Knobling and Robin Edwards, were discovered in Isle of Wight County in late 1987, the lack of a unified command structure meant that Isle of Wight County police were initially resistant to turning over control. Despite the obvious psychological parallels to the Thomas Dowski case, they saw shooting. The FBI saw strangulation. They saw a boat ramp. The FBI saw a historic parkway. The differing MOs and locations, intentionally varied by the killer, were amplified by the police's territorial instincts. The FBI had to fight for months to persuade the various county sheriffs and local police forces that they were all hunting the same man. This constant need to build consensus and overcome institutional resistance meant that investigators were spending more time on interagency meetings than they were on the streets, allowing the killer to operate entirely unchallenged. The VSP was forced, in one frustrating instance, to physically pull officers out of a joint meeting because of a command dispute, a scenario that played out directly into the killer's favor. The crucial flaw in the Colonial Parkway investigation lay in the failure to establish an early centralized MO analysis. The killer's signature was not the weapon, but the staging, the disabled car, the removal of keys, the untouched wallets, and the remote location. This psychological consistency spoke louder than any forensic detail. Yet law enforcement struggled for months to see the pattern beyond the surface difference in violence. They were stuck in the 1980s mindset of needing identical MOs to confirm a serial killer, failing to grasp the profile of a predator whose control manifested through adaptability. When the third pair, Sandy Hailey and Keith Call, vanished from the York River overlook in April 1988, the panic was absolute. The FBI finally established a full task force, but they were already fighting a ghost. The killer was now so brazen that he had returned to the original crime scene and left behind a car with the door open. A final blatant taunt to the agency that had failed to catch him after 2 previous attacks. The task force was flooded with leads and tips, a chaotic deluge that consumed resources. They chased red herring sightings across Virginia. But the physical evidence linking the first 3 sets of crimes, a piece of rope here, a tire impression there, was scattered, poorly documented, and often compromised by the initial handling. The inability to unify the evidence chain meant that any potential legal case against a suspect was already hopelessly weak. The Colonial Parkway killer had been granted immunity by the very system designed to stop him. The investigators were haunted by the psychological certainty of the killer's identity, but utterly lacked the legal and forensic tools to stop him. By the summer of 1988, following the vanishing of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call, the public terror in Virginia reached a saturation point. The fear was no longer abstract. It was personal. Every local teenager who sought privacy on a back road, every family member who worried about a loved one driving home late, was forced to confront the terrible reality that an invisible predator controlled the night. The idyllic image of the historic triangle, a place of quiet, scholarly dignity, was irrevocably stained by the name Colonial Parkway Killer. The investigative task force, finally centralized under the FBI, was chasing ghosts. They had confirmed the killer was mobile, adaptable, and a master of exploiting institutional gaps. They understood the psychology. The motive was purely sadistic control, evidenced by the meticulous staging and the refusal to take valuables. The killer's signature was the abandoned car, a silent, chilling monument to his dominance left at the edge of the wilderness. The failure to find Hailey and Call haunted the FBI. Their case was a declaration of the killer's invincibility. He had rendered the most extensive manhunt useless by simply making his victims disappear without a trace. This void, The agony of the missing is a psychological weapon that prolongs the crime indefinitely for the families left behind, denying them the closure needed to begin grieving. The killer achieved a level of power reserved for only the most organized predators, the power to deny reality itself to his victims' loved ones. Then, the fourth and final set of victims brought the spree to its horrifying conclusion and highlighted the persistence of the killer's confidence. The victims were Anna Maria Phelps, 18, and Daniel Lauer, 21. It was September 1989, 2 full years after the second set of murders. Anna Maria and Daniel were traveling to Virginia Beach when they got lost. They made the fatal error of pulling over onto the shoulder of Interstate 64, a major artery connecting to the Colonial Parkway system, to check a map. This simple act of confusion and vulnerability placed them directly in the killer's path. The time frame, the location, and the circumstances suggested a return to the killer's favored environment. Isolated stretches of road, accessible by car, offering easy escape. Their car, a gold 1978 Chevrolet Nova, was discovered abandoned near an Interstate 64 rest stop in New Kent County on September 5, 1989. The staging was once again inconsistent. The car was unlocked. Daniel's wallet was left inside, but this time, Daniel's shirt was found neatly tied around the steering column. This bizarre detail was immediately recognized as the killer's psychological fingerprint, a moment of calculated control, a strange, new ritualistic action performed after the abduction. It reinforced the profile of a killer who treated the crime scene as a signature canvas. The police knew they were facing the same hand that had murdered the previous 3 couples. The psychological impact of this MO shift, moving from the historic parkway to the busy anonymous I-64 corridor, was a clear sign of the killer's evolving strategy. He demonstrated that he was not emotionally tied to the parkway, but rather to the act of gaining control in an isolated vehicular environment. Furthermore, choosing the I-64 rest stop, a location under the watch of yet another separate police force, was a final cold act of bureaucratic defiance. The renewed search, despite the tragic lessons learned, was again hampered by initial misidentification. New Kent County Police were hesitant to immediately connect the crime to the Parkway spree, wasting critical time. Furthermore, the car, found near a busy interstate, was quickly towed before forensic experts could thoroughly process the scene for trace evidence, repeating the fundamental error made with the Honda Civic years earlier. This continued lack of interagency trust meant the same procedural failures protected the killer time and time again. The evidence was lost not to the wilderness, but to the tow yard. The search lasted weeks. In October 1989, a month after their disappearance, a group of hunters discovered the severely decomposed remains of Anna Maria and Daniel in a dense swampy area known as the Croker section of the Queen Creek drainage system, miles from where their car was found. The manner of death was critical. They had been violently stabbed. The fourth variation in MO, this final shift from strangulation and cutting to shooting to stabbing, proved the killer's complete mastery over the investigation. He was intentionally creating a lack of forensic consistency while maintaining the psychological consistency of the staged abandonment. He was fluid, adaptable, and utterly arrogant. This wide range of weapons suggested that the killer was simply comfortable with extreme violence and adapted the weapon based on the suddenness of the opportunity, or perhaps to simply avoid creating a single predictable pattern. The Colonial Parkway murders had now expanded to 4 couples, 8 victims, over a 3-year span, linked only by the killer's meticulous choreography of the crime scene aftermath. He was at the height of his power, having successfully hunted and killed for 3 years without leaving a prosecutable trace. The terrifying question was no longer who the killer was, but whether he would ever stop. But then, just as suddenly as the terror began, the Colonial Parkway killer vanished. After the September 1989 murders, the attacks ceased entirely. The predator, who had successfully terrorized an entire region, went silent. The intense police presence, the freezing temperatures, or perhaps incarceration, relocation, or death, had finally taken him off the map. He had achieved the ultimate criminal triumph, walking away undetected, leaving the victims' families, the police, and the entire community trapped in the cold shadow of his unresolved terror. By late 1989, with the Colonial Parkway killer's spree abruptly ended, the FBI task force was left with a powerful, yet useless psychological profile. The killer had vanished, leaving behind the shattered lives of 8 victims and an investigative file overflowing with procedural errors. The task force had succeeded in linking the cases, but their victory was hollow. They had identified the pattern too late and failed to secure the evidence required for a prosecution. The composite profile they developed painted a picture of a suspect who was locally familiar but not immediately known to police, possessing military or maritime experience, and likely driving a clean, unremarkable sedan or truck. He was organized, highly intelligent, and above all, arrogant. His MO changes were designed not just to kill, but to defeat the system. And he had succeeded. The tragedy of the Colonial Parkway investigations, however, lay not just in the killer's actions, but in the technological vacuum of the era. The 1980s lacked modern DNA testing. Any potential skin cells, semen, or hair fibers recovered from the contaminated crime scenes were subjected to rudimentary blood typing, which could only narrow the suspect pool to a massive, useless demographic. Key pieces of physical evidence, such as the rope used in the Thomas Dowski case, yielded no usable identifiers at the time. The killer was operating at a moment when forensic science was powerless to trace him. When the Colonial Parkway killer ceased his attacks in late 1989, the silence that fell over the historic triangle was not the silence of peace, but the cold, heavy silence of an unresolved threat. The local police forces retreated behind their jurisdictional walls, and the FBI, unable to secure a prosecutable lead, classified the Colonial Parkway murders as an official cold case. For the vast majority of law enforcement, the file was closed, relegated to dusty storage rooms, a grim, unsolvable monument to the limitations of 1980s police work. But for the families of the 8 victims, and for a small, tenacious group of detectives, the nightmare was just beginning its agonizing second act. This was the long freeze, a period that lasted over 2 decades, defined by grief, technological stasis, and a quiet, desperate hope. The emotional burden of this cold case was immense, particularly for the families of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call. With no remains ever recovered, their families were trapped in a uniquely cruel form of emotional purgatory. Every thunderstorm, every local rumor, every news report about a newly discovered set of remains in the state sent the families spiraling through cycles of renewed hope and crushing despair. They could not hold a funeral. They could not visit a grave. Their loved ones were merely vanished, their final moments held captive by the arrogance of an unknown killer. This lack of physical closure meant their grief could never truly begin its healing process. It remained a raw, open wound, a constant daily battle against an invisible enemy. The families were forced into the devastating role of perpetual searchers, dedicating their lives to a cause the police had largely abandoned. The investigation, meanwhile, was slowly being strangled by the lack of technology. The key pieces of evidence from the 4 crime scenes, the nautical rope fragments, the degraded fingerprints lifted from the Honda Civic, the shell casings from the Knobling and Edwards murder, and the physical items from the Lauer and Phelps scene, were preserved, but utterly useless in the pre-DNA era. Forensic science in the 1990s offered little hope for these cases. Without a suspect match, blood typing could narrow the field to a massive percentage of the male population, but it could not pinpoint the individual. Furthermore, the early contamination of the crime scenes, a direct consequence of the initial jurisdictional turf war, meant that even if technology had existed, much of the evidence would have been legally inadmissible due to broken chain of custody protocol. The investigative work devolved into a tedious, exhausting process of elimination. Detectives cross-referenced thousands of individuals, local felons, drifters, military personnel stationed at nearby bases, given the nautical, not lead, and anyone who had access to the isolated areas. Every local who owned a gun, every man with a violent past, was investigated and eliminated. The sheer volume of suspects, compounded by the constant jurisdictional issues, overwhelmed the small teams dedicated to the case. The killer was protected not by genius, but by the volume of people the police had to process and the technological paralysis of the era. The vastness of the databases was useless without a molecular fingerprint. The sheer volume of aging physical evidence posed its own forensic problem. With multiple victims and multiple crime sites, which piece of evidence deserved the limited budget for DNA testing first? The fragmented nature of the investigation meant there was no consensus, and often, testing was delayed simply because of the cost and the lack of political will to prioritize a cold case from the 1980s. The families, realizing this grim reality, often stepped in to raise funds themselves, essentially privatizing the forensic budget for a case the government had given up on. The persistent failure of law enforcement to solve the case eventually led to a fundamental breakdown of trust within the community and among the families. Rumors flourished, filling the void left by official silence. Theories ranging from satanic cults, a popular media obsession of the time, to a mad trucker passing through the state gained traction, diverting what few resources remained. The most painful rumor, however, centered on the killer being a member of law enforcement itself, given the killer's apparent ability to control crime scenes and evade detection near police installations. This deep-seated suspicion was fueled by the initial corruption and failure of the official investigation, and the reluctance of agencies to share information, breeding conspiracy. During this long silence, the primary suspects, the phantom composite sketches, aged. The profile the FBI had carefully crafted grew stale. The physical descriptions, already vague, became less relevant as the years passed. The only constant was the sheer, enduring pain of the families, who kept the case alive through sheer force of will. They became grassroots investigators, organizing their own searches of the dense riverbanks, printing new flyers, and ensuring the memory of the victims was not filed away. They founded organizations dedicated to maintaining pressure on the VSP and FBI, becoming reluctant experts in cold case advocacy. They became the necessary conscience of the investigation. Crucially, the handful of detectives who carried the case file through the 1990s did so largely on personal commitment. These were individuals who, years after the task force dissolved, dedicated their lunch breaks and retirement hours to pulling the old boxes out of storage. They fought internal battles against supervisors who insisted the case was closed and unwinnable. This commitment required a profound moral certainty of the killer's guilt and a deep sense of responsibility to the victims' families, effectively turning the cold case division into an ad hoc volunteer operation. They were fueled by the knowledge that the original failure was procedural, not criminal. The one silver lining in this bleak period was the preservation of the physical evidence. Despite the shoddy collection practices in the initial golden hours, the physical items, the victim's clothing, the rope, the trace fibers, were eventually sealed and placed in temperature-controlled storage. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, technology began to catch up to the tragedy. The development of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, and short tandem repeat analysis offered the first faint glimmer of hope that the scientific ghost of the killer might still be trapped on one of those old, forgotten pieces of evidence. The small amount of biological material that survived decades of poor handling suddenly held the potential key to the entire mystery. A new generation of investigators, often retired detectives working pro bono or cold case specialists, began to petition the FBI and the VSB to reopen the files. They argued that the mistakes of the 1980s should not condemn the case forever. The case was not defined by the incompetence of its start, but by the potential of its scientific future. The battle to get the FBI to commit resources and fund the new, expensive DNA testing would become the first major hurdle of the modern investigation. A frustrating struggle to overcome decades of institutional lethargy and denial. The Colonial Parkway murders were about to enter their molecular phase, determined by the microscopic evidence left behind in the dark. The battle waged by the victims' families and the few dedicated cold case detectives finally paid off in the mid-2000s. The FBI and the Virginia State Police, facing mounting public and internal pressure, committed resources to apply modern DNA technology to the decades-old evidence. The focus was on microscopic evidence, trace biological material that the killer might have unwittingly left behind on a binding, a vehicle interior, or even the victim's clothing. Forensic scientists, working in climate-controlled labs that were the antithesis of the dark, damp crime scenes of the 1980s, began the painstaking process of analysis. The material they worked with was minute, degraded, and often mixed with contaminants from the original, compromised investigation. They were looking for the needle in the forensic haystack, using technology that the killer never could have imagined when he committed his final crime in 1989. The initial breakthroughs were cautious but significant. Using advanced mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, testing, a technique useful for tracing maternal lineage from degraded hair samples, investigators were able to filter out some of the irrelevant biological material, such as DNA belonging to the victims or the initial first response. This filtering process was vital, as it allowed the scientists to focus on minute male genetic material that could belong only to an external actor. Then came the first major, irrefutable strike of forensic certainty. From a sample taken from one of the original 1986 crime scenes, analysts successfully isolated a full short tandem repeat star profile. This star profile, the gold standard of DNA identification, belonged to an unknown male. It was the genetic signature of the Colonial Parkway killer, trapped on an item of evidence that had been sitting in a dusty box for over 20 years. The discovery was a monumental, silent revolution within the case file. After decades of relying on vague sketches and psychological profiles, the FBI finally had a molecular fingerprint. The profile was immediately uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders. The wait was excruciating, but the results were ultimately frustrating. The killer was not in the system. He was not a known felon in the jurisdiction, reinforcing the profile that he was highly organized and had successfully avoided conviction for any crime serious enough to require a DNA sample. This also dashed the earlier, hopeful theory that the killer had been taken off the streets via incarceration for a minor crime. He remained an invisible phantom. However, the DNA profile itself provided the investigation with its first real target. The focus shifted from searching the entire state to finding the source of that specific genetic code. Investigators began the methodical process of familial DNA searching, seeking out local men who were relatives of the unknown profile. A painstaking process that required political will and technological commitment. With traditional law enforcement databases yielding no match for the Colonial Parkway killer's star profile, The investigation entered its final, painstaking phase: genetic genealogy. This strategy required a complete pivot, moving the search from the criminal justice system's private files to the public domain of ancestry websites, a move that was both groundbreaking and controversial. Investigators, working with external forensic genealogists, uploaded the killer's DNA profile to publicly accessible platforms. The objective was not to find the killer directly, but to find distant cousins, third, fourth, or even fifth cousins, who shared significant segments of the unknown profile's DNA. This process transformed the hunt from a simple database query into a massive, multi-generational historical research project. The initial results were a chaotic tangle of thousands of familial connections, spreading across the state and into neighboring regions. The genealogists had to meticulously chart the family tree, working backward through birth records, marriage licenses, census data, and old obituaries. They were searching for a common ancestral couple, a point in time where the killer's lineage converged with that of his distant DNA matches. Once this common ancestor was identified, the tree could then be built forward, focusing on the living male descendants who fit the age and geographical profile of the Colonial Parkway killer. This labor was immense, requiring the cross-referencing of hundreds of names. The team had to eliminate countless innocent individuals who simply shared the same great-great-grandparents as the killer. Slowly, methodically, the pool of potential suspects narrowed. The search focused hard on men who were alive during the 1986-1989 murder spree and who had lived in the historic Triangle region. The psychological profile, a local male with familiarity with the isolated roads and perhaps military or maritime links, was laid over the family tree like a final filter. The genealogical search finally led the task force to a single, previously overlooked individual: Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. Wilmer's life was unremarkable. He was a local man, known to the community, who owned a small auto repair shop and often frequented the same isolated areas as the victims. He fit the age and general description. Crucially, he had never been charged with a felony that would have placed his DNA in CODIS. He had died in 2017, meaning the scientific breakthrough arrived decades too late for traditional prosecution. The killer, Alan Wilmer Sr., had successfully used the passage of time as his ultimate defense. The investigation now faced its most painful hurdle: confirming the identity. Since Wilmer was deceased, investigators had to obtain a judicial order to exhume his body. This legal maneuvering was necessary to retrieve a definitive DNA sample. Under dark, private circumstances, Wilmer's remains were exhumed. Forensic analysts successfully extracted high-quality DNA from the aged remains and performed the final definitive comparison against the SDAR profile found on the evidence from the 1986 Thomas Dowski murder scene. The match was irrefutable. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was identified as the source of the male DNA found on the evidence. The decades of uncertainty, the bureaucratic infighting, and the agonizing grief of the families finally found a focal point: the sheer weight of the truth that the killer had been a local, hiding in plain sight, was immense. The FBI publicly stated that they had definitively identified the killer in the Thomas Dowski case, bringing a degree of official recognition to the families. However, Wilmer's death created a new, agonizing set of legal and emotional constraints. Since he could not be tried, the investigation had to shift focus. Could they definitively link him to the two missing couples, Sandy Hailey and Keith Call, whose bodies were never found? Without a confession or a successful interrogation, investigators were left without the critical map to their final resting places. Wilmer's death ensured that those secrets and the final details of the 4 different MOAs — strangulation, shooting, disappearance, stabbing — died with him. The pursuit of the truth had won, but the pursuit of justice and complete closure for all 8 victims had been permanently lost to time. The grim, final irony of the case remained. The killer had succeeded in evading earthly justice. His identity was revealed only after his death, leaving the families with the truth, but without the closure of a conviction. The families, however, continue to push for the other 6 victims to be officially and formally attributed to Wilmer, ensuring the scope of the Colonial Parkway killer's terror is never minimized. The decades of silence were broken, not by a confession in a crowded courtroom, but by a microscopic fingerprint in a sterile lab. The story of the Colonial Parkway murders finally concluded its core mystery, not with the dramatic triumph of a detective chasing down a fleeing suspect, but with the inevitable cold certainty of 21st century science, correcting the catastrophic errors of the past. The discovery and confirmation of Alan Way Wilmer Esser as the source of the male DNA found on the 1986 Thomas Dowski crime scene evidence provided the long-sought truth. But this truth brought with it a chilling realization that unsettled the community far more than the mystery ever had. It confirmed the terrifying psychological profile. The killer was not a passing phantom, a drifter, or a monster hiding in a cave. He was a local. He was a neighbor. He was a predator who successfully blended into the very fabric of the community he was dismantling, hiding in plain sight behind the unremarkable facade of a small business owner and a fisherman. For decades, the people of the historic triangle scanned the horizon for a boogeyman, unaware that he was likely standing next to them in line at the grocery store, or fixing their transmission at his auto repair shop. Wilmer didn't just live in the area. He was woven into it. He navigated the same roads, fished the same rivers, and breathed the same air as the families he destroyed. This is the banality of evil in its purest form, the ability of a monster to wear the mask of the mundane, to commit atrocities under the cover of darkness, and then wake up the next morning and go to work as if nothing had happened. The hunt was over, but the pursuit of justice remained permanently, agonizingly incomplete. Wilmer's death in 2017, decades after he should have been brought to trial, ensured that the families were robbed of the catharsis of a public prosecution. There would be no reading of the charges. There would be no victim impact statements read to his face. There would be no moment where the gavel came down and stripped him of his freedom. He escaped earthly punishment, carrying the secrets of 6 other victims, and perhaps more, to his grave. We are left to imagine the phantom trial that never happened. We are left to wonder what he might have said if cornered. Would he have confessed to the locations of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call? Would he have explained why he stopped, or if he ever really did? The death of a suspect before capture is a final act of theft. He stole their lives, and then, by dying a free man, he stole the final chapter of their story. The true legacy of the Colonial Parkway murders is not just the tragedy of the 8 victims, but the systemic, enduring failure of the institutions sworn to protect them. The entire spree was a masterclass in exploiting the cracks in the American justice system. First, the jurisdictional turf war between the National Park Service, the Virginia State Police, and the FBI in 1986 was a tragic ego battle that led to the contamination of the crucial first crime scene. It was a failure of leadership that prioritized badges over bodies. Second, the pervasive linkage blindness allowed the killer to shift his MO, moving from strangulation to stabbing, and shift his locations. From the parkway to boat ramps to interstate rest areas for 3 years, without the police being able to unify the pattern effectively. The system was looking for a pattern. The killer was an agent of chaos. Third, the technological gap of the 1980s, which the killer successfully utilized to ensure that the small amount of evidence he did leave behind was unprosecutable for decades. This case stands as a painful, permanent reminder that the system itself was the killer's most effective ally. The fact that the murder weapon's genetic signature and the unique evidence, the nautical knot, the medical tape dispenser, were effectively ignored or rendered useless by procedural errors is the final damning indictment against the initial investigation. But the most haunting aspect of this conclusion lies in the geography itself. For the families of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call, the ambiguity endures in a way that is almost impossible to articulate. Wilmer's death means the map to their final resting place may be lost forever. The Colonial Parkway, the York River, and the dense woods of the Virginia Peninsula are vast. Somewhere in that dark territory, amidst the roots of the old-growth pines or the silt of the riverbed, Sandy and Keith remain. This is a specific type of torture known as ambiguous loss. Grief without a focal point, mourning without a grave. Their loved ones remain vanished, a continuous, raw testament to the ultimate trophy the Colonial Parkway killer claimed: the denial of closure. To this day, every time a dredger pulls something from the York River, or a hiker finds a bone in the woods, the families are forced to relive the trauma, wondering if this is finally the day the silence breaks. And we must ask ourselves about the silence of the killer. Did he truly stop in 1989? Serial predators rarely cease their violence voluntarily. Did he relocate? Did he change his methods entirely to avoid the intensifying heat of the task force? Or did he simply become better at hiding the evidence, operating in the shadows for another 20 years? The identification of Wilmer opens up a terrifying Pandora's box of cold cases in Virginia. How many other unsolved disappearances or hit and runs in the 1990s and 2000s might be the work of this same man? The police have closed the file on the Colonial Parkway, but the audit of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s life is only just beginning. The Colonial Parkway today remains beautiful, tranquil, and historic. The tourists still come to see the fall foliage. The cyclists still ride the ribbon of asphalt. But for the families who fought for decades, and for the agents who refused to let the file close, it remains a landscape defined by a cold, finished horror. The scenic overlooks are no longer just viewpoints, they are crime scenes. The river is no longer just water, it is a vault of secrets. The resolution of this case proves that time is no longer a sanctuary for killers. The science of genetic genealogy has fundamentally altered the balance of power. There is no statute of limitations on DNA. There's no hiding place deep enough, no alias secure enough to protect a predator from his own biology. The hidden killer thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the police, outlasted the task forces, and taken his secrets to the grave. But he was wrong. He left a piece of himself behind, a molecular breadcrumb that waited patiently in a cardboard box for 30 years, waiting for the future to arrive. The search for complete truth continues, driven by the hope of formally linking Wilmer to all 8 victims and ensuring their full story is told. We may never have a conviction, but we have the truth. And in the dark territories of the unknown, the truth is the only light we have. If this deep dive into the terror and betrayal on the Colonial Parkway has opened your eyes to the hidden dangers of our nation's most isolated places, please support our ongoing investigations. We rely on your engagement to continue shining an unflinching light into these dark territories. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the trust we place in authority and the fragility of justice when jurisdictional lines are drawn in the sand. Let us know in the comments below. What aspect of this case haunts you the most? Is it the bureaucratic infighting that let a killer roam free? Is it the psychological terror of a predator who could vanish into normal life? Or is it the heartbreaking, unresolved silence that still surrounds the missing bodies of Sandy Hailey and Keith Call? If you want to be the first to know when we open the file on the next terrifying failure of justice, please take a moment to subscribe to the Plain Sight Docs channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in America's dark territories. Thank you for watching. Travel safe. Trust your instincts. Right. And always remember the price of silence on the road.